Hello everyone. I'm Nicola Laurent, the Australian Society of Archivists President, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar or its recording. I will begin with the ASA's Acknowledgement of Country. The Australian Society of Archivists acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from across Australia and the surrounding seas and recognise their continuing connection to land, water, culture and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present. We honour your local community traditions of caring for archives and culture through country, through songs and stories. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands people are on across the world, and I would particularly like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations whose unceded and stolen land I am joining you from today. As part of International Archives Week, with the theme of empowering archives, and on International Archives Day itself, for those in Australia, the ASA, along with the International Council on Archives, the Council of Australasian Archives and Records Authorities, the State Records South Australia, the National Archives of Australia, and Archives New Zealand, are pleased to host this webinar on empowering cultural change, government archives responses to implementing the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration. This is particularly pertinent for the ASA, as after representatives signed the declaration when it was first presented in 2019, at our last council meeting in May, the ASA Council unanimously endorsed the Tandanya Declaration, with the hope that clear endorsement by the ASA will lead to greater take-up and further action to implement it within the Australian archival community. Before I hand over to our moderator today, Normand Chauvineau, we are live streaming the webinar on the ICA's Facebook page and on the ASA's YouTube channel. We encourage participants to comment and ask questions using whichever option is available to you, and these will come through to the presenters. If they are directed at a particular presenter, please make that clear. It's being recorded for those unable to join us live and will be made available through both the ICA and the ASA YouTube channels. Comments made on YouTube and Facebook will be visible to people viewing the recording as well. And finally, you can also join the conversation on social media using the hashtags Empowering Archives or IAW 2021. But now to introduce Normand. Normand has been working at Libraries and Archives Canada since 2015 as Deputy Librarian and Archivist of Canada and Chief Operating Officer. He is also the Vice President Program of the International Council on Archives, and before joining LAC, he was the State Archivist of the Province of Quebec. Please take it away, Normand.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm talking to you from Montreal, a city built on the unceded territory of the Mohawk Nation, member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in North America. Please note that Nicola will join us during the Q&As to answer all questions related to the role the ASA intend to play in relation with the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration. In order to keep as much time for the Q&As, I will say only a few words about our speakers. Please go to the event web page to be able to read their more substantive bio. Our first speaker tonight is, today for you. Our first speaker is Phyllis Williams. Phyllis is Gumluk Bun from her father with ancestral lands in West Arnhem Land and Larakia Kulumbirijin from her mother with ancestral lands in Darwin and the Cox Peninsula. Phyllis joined the National Archives of Australia in April 2096, where she's currently Director, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Engagement. Phyllis is also co-chair of the International Council on Archives Expert Group on Indigenous Matters and a member of the Council of Australasian Archives and Records Authorities, First Nations, working.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone. We've apparently lost Normand a moment, so we're just going to try and bring him back a second. Due to the fact he was mid-presentation, and he will have the best introduction. So please bear with us just a moment. Otherwise, we will move on with the rest of the presentations and bring them on back for the discussion part.
there's a thunderstorm. So if I go back to our friend Phyllis. So Phyllis is introducing the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration in the context of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the work of the ICA expert group she is co-chairing. To you, Phyllis. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Before I speak about the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration, Nganaga, Nyana, Phyllis Williams, Nyanaga, Gurambira, Larakia, Guadangalaba, Gwailwa Daranigi Miller. My name is Phyllis Williams. My mother is Larakia, and this is our land. I'm speaking today on the land of the Larakia Gulambirigan people, the land of my mother, grandmother, and generations before, and acknowledge them and other Larakia Gulambirigan people. And I pay my respects to my past elders and the present and emerging people. I also acknowledge Maan Gallagher, other First Nations people from Australia and from around the world attending the webinar. Now, about the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration. In October 2019, the International Council on Archives and its expert group on Indigenous Matters issued the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration, calling on jurisdictional archives of the world to acknowledge and adopt the 5 themes and commitments for immediate action. To challenge archives to reimagine the meaning of archives as an emerging model of social memory, to embrace Indigenous worldviews and methods of creating, sharing, and preserving valued knowledge, and to decolonize, in particular, our archival principles with Indigenous knowledge methods, to open the meaning of public archives to Indigenous interpretations, and to bring new dynamics to spirituality, ecology, and Indigenous philosophy into the European traditions of archival memory. Theme 1 is about knowledge authorities. It's acknowledging there are Indigenous cognitive frameworks to understand ideas of history, memory, heritage, and cultural identity. And the Declaration promotes a respectful, ethical relationship between archival institutions and Indigenous communities to recognise the diversity of social meanings embodied in archival materials and the knowledge models that interpret them. Theme 2, about property and ownership. Understanding that there is a need for state-sanctioned archival institutions to recognise Indigenous ownership of Indigenous traditional knowledge, cultural expression, knowledge and intellectual property. Theme 3, recognition and identity. Indigenous peoples have the right to be recognised in archival representational systems. For example, in the arrangement and description of archives, as holding unique kinship, identity, and cultures as distinct peoples. Theme 4 covers research and access. Recognising research and access to archival records is a socially mediated process and a conceptual site of conflict between European and Indigenous ways of knowing. The Declaration recognises access to records containing traditional Indigenous cultural expression, sacred beliefs, social and legal knowledge must recognise and apply the social, legal and cultural protocols of the affiliated communities. And so this should be done with the affiliated community. Theme 5 covers self-determination. As noted in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples have the right to self-determination by virtue of that right they feel. They freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. The Declaration recognised to safeguard and share the memories of Indigenous heritage is to promote its survival and resurgence as a human right. The Tandanya Declaration draws on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the UN Declaration writes, and I quote, is a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world and it elaborates on existing human rights, standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply to the specific situation of Indigenous peoples. The Tandanya Declaration, and I'll quote, states a rebalanced, decolonised archival heritage recognises that a more democratic social memory of colonisation is a difficult but necessary step in the ethical progress of humanity. The ICA Expert Group on Indigenous Matters was established in November 2018 and provides a forum for higher level discussions of issues related to the recognition of Indigenous worldviews as vital components of archival theory and method and the development of protocols for Indigenous knowledge management. The group's current membership includes Dr. Karine Duhamel and Raymond Frogner from Canada, Dr. Minako Sakata from Japan, Hinerangi Himeona from New Zealand, Dr. Jennifer O'Neill from the United States of America, Inga Marja Steinfeld from Norway, Patricia Canales from Chile, and Kirsten Thorpe and I from Australia. The expert group on Indigenous Matters with the National Archives of Australia, as we've heard, delivered the ICA Indigenous Matters Summit, See Us, Hear Us, Walk With Us, Challenging and Decolonising the Archives in Adelaide, South Australia on the 25th of October 2019. The expert group has been focusing on translating the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration, and to date it has been translated in French, Spanish, Norwegian, Russian and German. Discussions have been flagged to investigate Australian Indigenous languages translation as well. After a 2020 hiatus, the group will reconnect to especially socialise the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration with Indigenous peoples and across archives, and focus discussions on new projects in 2021. Back to you, Norman.
Simon is Director and State Archivist at the State Record of South Australia. State Record is on Kaurna land, including a presence on Tandanya-Adelaide as well. And Simon is as well the Council of Australasian Archives and Record Authorities Chair. Simon and the State Records of South Australia focused over the recent years has been to ensure government organizations understand the value and importance of their information to the broader community and working towards improving accessibility for the most vulnerable in society. To you, Simon.
Thank you, Normand. And welcome everybody today. I acknowledge that I'm on Kaurna land today and that I pay my respects to the Kaurna people and their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people who are joining this event today and those who will view the event later. I'm humbled to be here alongside David, Taylor, Phyllis and Normand and to be speaking to a matter which is of such importance to all of us. More than that though, it feels like we're at a point in time where real and lasting change is upon us and that the steps we take now will have a long-lasting and significant impact. I'd also like to make it clear that in my opinion, the Declaration, like so many other things, is not on its own going to solve the issues we face in better connecting with First Nations people, in better representing their voices or in better representing the history of our countries. We have to acknowledge the racism still inherent in our societies and structures and that the institutions we work in have contributed to that view, a view based on colonial power. The Declaration is, however, another step in the right direction, one that builds on and supports other protocols and approaches, and if considered and acted upon with respect, trust and vulnerability, then hopefully we will see real and lasting change. For us here in Adelaide, South Australia, on Kaurna land, the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration is a very important and powerful statement. As we've heard mentioned from Phyllis, the Declaration was presented at the joint ICA-ASA conference in October 2019, and it means that the Declaration holds increased significance for South Australians generally, but importantly for the many Aboriginal communities in South Australia and for the archivists, not just in state records, but many other independent archives across our state. As I've mentioned, the Declaration is an important statement for us here in South Australia. The very fact that it was announced here in Adelaide has meant that it has resonated both with my Minister, the Attorney-General, but also the Premier, who is also Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. The Attorney spoke at the launch of the Declaration, and both her and the Premier have been provided with formal copies of the signed Declaration. The Declaration has provided something tangible and important, and importantly, it has come at a right time and been seen by the right people. It has given impetus to us, and it has strengthened the understanding of those outside of our profession of the need to act and the need to do so quickly. Looking at the response from South Australia and the steps that we've taken to date, I think most importantly, first and foremost, any response or action related to the Declaration must be First Nations led. Sitting here as a middle-aged white man who has worked for the past 25 years in the South Australian government, I'm not well placed to respond to this document or to set the agenda. It is critical that my agency's response is led by the voices of Aboriginal people from the communities affected by our services and records. My role in this is to listen to those Aboriginal voices about what the vision should be and to then ensure that my agency responds to that vision. To this end, the first thing that State Records of South Australia did was to bring together staff from the organisation, along with elders from some of the South Australian Aboriginal communities and representatives from the Healing Foundation, Indigenous researchers, Link Up and the Office of Aboriginal Affairs. We did this in early 2020, just before COVID became a worldwide pandemic, and in this respect, we were very lucky. That coming together allowed myself and my staff to hear firsthand what the Declaration meant to Aboriginal people in South Australia, and importantly, what they wanted and expected from us. And based on those discussions at that event, we've developed a number of actions. However, it's really important that people understand that these actions are based on the understanding that there is a lot more engagement and collaboration that needs to occur with Aboriginal communities in South Australia. It's imperative that the voices of Aboriginal people are heard at the start and throughout the work that we do here at State Records of South Australia. Any action taken by the archive in response to the Declaration, and more broadly in relation to any of the work that we do that impacts Aboriginal people, whether that be in providing advice or the development of policy, must be informed by the voices of Aboriginal communities in South Australia. Our first step in achieving this is for us to establish an Aboriginal reference group, which will provide advice, direction and insight into what the Declaration means to communities in SA and what their expectation is of the archive in responding to it. In this, we have partnered with the State Library of South Australia in establishing this group, and we will be looking to expand that through inviting other archival organisations to participate in those discussions. In this, we're looking at bringing in our partners from the religious archives in South Australia and also other institutions. Whilst ourselves and the State Library will have initiatives, projects and programmes that we want to discuss with the group, it is very important and very much my intent that the group provides a voice that will drive the changes that we need to make. The group will also act as a conduit to the broader Aboriginal community so that we can seek the broader views. It is our expectation that expressions of interest for membership of this group will commence in the coming weeks, with the establishment of the group later on this calendar year. In late 2020, I sought advice of Dr. Roger Thomas, who's the Commissioner for Aboriginal Engagement here in South Australia, and I continue to be appreciative of Dr. Thomas's time in helping us and his willingness to share his wisdom and knowledge. Since that initial meeting, we have met and discussed numerous matters, including the establishment of the reference group and the body of work which State Records is looking to achieve. Dr. Thomas and his office will continue to be a stakeholder for us, as well as an important voice. Looking forward, our first priority is to establish the Aboriginal reference group, and from there we'll be guided by the views of that group. This is a key aspect of our response, and we do not want to impose the archival or government system view. We want the discussions to be led first and foremost by the community. There are many aspects of the Declaration that we need to take into account and that we need to bring to the attention of the reference group and to seek the views of the community. In doing so, we hope that the voices of the community will be loud and clear, and that we will work with those groups and with individuals to make sure that the services that we provide here at State Records are fit for purposes of the Aboriginal communities. There have been many challenges so far, and I'm sure we will face many more. However, the biggest of those challenges from my perspective have not been about policy or process or practice. They have been about learning and understanding, about breaking down our own bias and our own barriers. So these include things like acknowledging and understanding our own organisational bias, the history of our organisations and what that means to the communities that we're trying to interact with. It's about acknowledging our failings and being vulnerable and open in the discussions that we have with Aboriginal people. We also need to be open to change, putting aside our ingrained professional view and accepting that there may be other ways of doing the work that we do to provide better access to our records and a better future for all of us. Before I finish and hand back to Normand, I'd just like to very briefly give an overview from CARA. So as the current chair of the Council of Australasian Archives and Records Authorities, CARA, I'm also aware of the discussions we've had as a body of government authorities in this space. CARA and its members have supported the declaration, and this support has been made public on the CARA website. We've endorsed the establishment of the First Nations Working Group to deliver a proposed work programme to the Council, to endorse and for members to implement. The aim of the working group is to, among other things, build upon the themes and commitments outlined in the declaration. Other CARA member institutions have endorsed the declaration and are considering or commencing their responses. This includes Public Records Office of Victoria, Queensland State Archives, National Archives of Australia and Archives New Zealand. Through the First Nations Working Group in CARA, Archives and Records Authorities will be liaising on their various approaches, learnings and consultation. And we hope that this approach across numerous jurisdictions will bring value and a better result for all concerned. Thank you for allowing me to speak this morning.
Thank you, Simon. Our third speaker is Taylor Ratt, Regional Archivist for the Auckland Regional Office, Te Rua Mahara o Te Kawanatanga, Archives New Zealand. Taylor belongs to the Ngati Tainga and Ngati Tarau Hapu of Te Nui Iwi, Waikato, New Zealand. Taylor came to the archives with a museum background. Her work as regional archivist includes managing the regional presence of Archives New Zealand, leads a full range of archives and regulatory services at regional and national level, and advising Ke Pupuri Matua, Chief Archivist, on those issues related to Archives New Zealand. To you, Taylor.
Aroha mai, I was muted. Tēnā koutou I ngā āhuatanga o te wā. Ko tainui te waka, ko taupere te maunga, ko Waikato te awa, ko tainui te iwi, ko Ngāti Tahinga rawa, ko Ngāti Tarao ngā hapu, ko te ako rawa, ko Opuatia ngā marae, ko Tyler Gilgan Roth tōku ingoa. Kei te rua mahara o Kawanatanga e mahi ana, ko Regional Archivist tōku tūranga mahi, tēnā koutou katoa. In short, that's my mihi whakatau, and part of that is to explain where I'm from, who I am, and who are the people I descend from. It also discloses my mahi within Te Rua Mahara or Te Kawanatanga, Archives New Zealand. Archives New Zealand has been operating since 1937. And part of parcel is that there is a long legacy in terms of how we look after our archives and our records. Part of that means that we haven't necessarily had Māori faces and Indigenous people within this institution, and part and parcel of that is as Nigel Burrell mentioned in January 2021, is that power is constructed to support colonial ideals and institutions and not necessarily the diversity of people in Aotearoa. The Tandanya Declaration therefore provides another platform. It's another rung in the ladder for how we can ensure to have Māori faces come in and take part in everything that we do around the taonga, the treasures, the records and archives that exist within each of our institutions. Tandanya plays a part in our narrative for Aotearoa and for Māori, where we currently have Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi that was signed in 1840 as a part of our legislated directions of how we should be engaging with Māori as partners in these institutions. Me being one of them on the inside, similar to a Trojan horse, is that essentially we get to start to change how we're thinking and that cultural shift in the way that we operate with and for, and well, essentially as Māori, we get to state how we would like to have things in institutions. Again, that reflects on that recognition and identity, the themes, the key principles of Tandanya Declaration, where we can then see a sense of ownership, but it can't be in isolation. Where we need to go to next needs to encompass all these different areas, which is where Aotearoa has Te Pai Tawhiti, the Waitangi Claim 262, as well as the government response Ko Aotearoa Tēnei. In that treaty claim, it is asking for the same principles that is reflected in Tandanya Declaration, another format that Māori in this Aotearoa context can push forward to see that self-determination, tino rangatiratanga, as well as ensuring that we have our own data sovereignty based around the records and information that we currently hold in our institutions. Part and parcel of what makes this quite a difficult and a big challenge for Archives New Zealand and within the Aotearoa context is that we are the largest employers of archivists within Aotearoa. So we're needing to see how we can incorporate and create an equitable playing field to ensure that Māori and our Pacific dimensions are involved from all levels across archives operation, and really to acknowledge that the need for change, cultural change, is not a project. It is in the ways that we do things. It's in across everything that we play part in. And what that essentially means is that we can't have one or two Māori or Pacific sitting in our institutions. That one is a very lonely number, and ensuring that we can create those spaces to have more representation sitting across all levels to ensure that the way we go forward reflects those principles within Tandanya Declaration, but also the Waitangi Claim 262 Te Pai Tawhiti. Ka pai. That will finish me off for now.
Thank you, Talia. Our fifth speaker will be Phyllis Williams, that we've met earlier, and the fourth is David Tricker. David joined the National Archives of Australia as Director General on January 1st, 2012. It was some sort of a Christmas gift. David's principal current challenge is to build the public's trust in government information. David is currently the president of the International Council on Archives and the vice chair of the UNESCO Memory of the World International Advisory Committee. To you, David.
Thank you very much, Normand. And may I start as well with an acknowledgement. Naji Njamali, Namri, Nunawal, Majigang Yanibu Jandu. I'm speaking to you from Ngambri Ngunnawal country, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Also, of course, to acknowledge my colleague, Phyllis Williams, Larrakia, Kulambirigan, and Gumulkaban woman, and to Taylor Roth and other First Nations people from Australia and around the world attending this webinar, or indeed watching the recording. Also, I'd like to thank you, Nicola, the ASA, my colleague Normand Charbonneau, and Simon, of course, my Kara colleague, for participating in this. Normand, what I'd like to do very briefly, just for 5 minutes or so, is just quickly make some comments to reaffirm the commitment of the National Archives to the Tandanya Declaration, and then hand over as quickly as possible to Phyllis to speak in more detail about the response. Excuse me. I guess from the background of the National Archives, our response, for the past 20 years or so, we have been, I suppose, trying to exercise as much respect and understanding for the proper stewardship of the records that we hold that concern the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia. We have been tailoring services to assist Indigenous Australians to access the National Archival collection for a range of purposes, including to link up with family and community, and in the way that we use those records in exhibitions, in events, and through our publishing and digital engagement exercises as well. And it was back in 2017 that we introduced our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander strategy, which also reflected our commitment to broaden and strengthen our capacity to engage in and with and meet the needs of Australian and Torres Strait Islander clients. And there are a few particular attributes that are embodied in that strategy. Firstly, that strategy commits the National Archives of Australia to acknowledge the historical and cultural context of records, to make sure that those records are being made available, publicly available, in a respectful and appropriate manner. It also commits us to consult with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities on how those records are used in our programs, and to sort of include the acknowledgement of country in all events in the public programs, and also for us to be mindful of the cultural sensitivities that may be present in records, such as secret or sacred business, references to deceased people, and also the use of terminology that may be, well, inaccurate, offensive, or otherwise present barriers to access and use of those records. Further, it commits us to value engagement and collaboration by the staff of the archives with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, communities and organisations. And I think, Simon, your comments on the South Australian approach are completely associate with those. I think this is extremely important. As another, I'm probably older than middle-aged Simon, but as a person with no credentials whatsoever in Indigenous affairs, but given the responsibility to manage this institution, I'm very, very fixed with the understanding that collaboration and consultation is vital in this. And to that also, that our strategy does commit us to develop our own staff. So Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff, particularly our non-Indigenous staff of the archives, to become more culturally aware and to build that cultural diversity in this institution. And speaking within the institution, you know, the way it goes not only to our public presentation, but the way we manage the collection, our collection management, our descriptive standards, our access policies, our employment and procurement policies within the archives, all of these things have to take account of proper respect and recognition of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander equities. And Simon, you also mentioned as well about this concept of institutional racism, and I think this is something I've kind of newly discovered through the many discussions we've been having lately, that of course racism does exist. It certainly exists in Australia, and there's a particular type of racism, which is the institutional racism, the way policies are made, the way laws are made, and the way that we've baked in these practices over many generations. We've built in this almost unconscious bias, which is a form of racism. And so this is all what our strategy is intending to do, is to remove that institutional racism from the practices and policies of this institution. Now, one of the things in the strategy that we did identify was the need for protocols, and this is protocols and how to work with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander records and peoples. And those protocols started development for us in 2019, which of course then coincided with the ICA-ASA conference in Adelaide, but also that Indigenous Affairs Summit and the production of the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration. And so that declaration has been such a strong motivator for us at the National Archives and the way that we've produced those protocols. And I really want to hand over to Phyllis to spend more time addressing those protocols. The other instrument I might mention is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which also provides instruments, in particular Article 13.1, which also has an article that proclaims Indigenous peoples' right to revitalise, use, develop and transmit to future generations their histories, languages and oral traditions. Now, the Australian government, the Commonwealth Government, endorsed the UNDRIP back in 2009, and this is also a very powerful informer into the way that we continue to formulate these protocols and our policies to put them into practice. So I would like to hand over to you, Phyllis, on that point, but simply for me to make my brief presentation here today, just to recommit the National Archives of Australia to what is still a long journey ahead of us. And again, I'm agreeing with you here, Simon. This is not a one-step journey. This is a long journey, but it's a long, sustained commitment to make this a reality. So if I may, Phyllis, hand over to you to expand a bit on our Atsi protocols. Thank you.
Thank you, David. The need for the protocols, as David mentioned, was identified in the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander strategy, and the National Archives Our Way Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander protocols has 5 overarching themes, and these are leadership, rights, access, authority and acknowledgement. Protocol 1, leadership. This is leadership at all levels. It ensures that services and activities are culturally appropriate. Protocol 2, rights, recognises that records may contain Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional and cultural knowledge. Protocol 3, access, is about engaging in two-way relationships. This is the National Archives to individuals and communities, and individuals and communities to the National Archives. Protocol 4 is authority. It's ensuring related collections are handled, stored, preserved and accessed in a culturally respectful and appropriate manner. Protocol 5 is acknowledgement. It's about expressing recognition of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. And in relation to actions and how the National Archives are going to do these, with Protocol 1, leadership, it's about the National Archives leading across the organisation to embrace the protocols to strengthen our engagement and collaboration with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. To facilitate diverse involvement and representation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on National Archives organisation bodies, regional consultative forums, national and international archive bodies, and special interest groups. Another action is to work to ensure a culturally diverse, culturally safe, and culturally aware workforce. And this includes partnerships for career pathways related to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in accordance with the National Archives Diversity and Workforce Plans. Leadership also focuses on developing diverse cultural capability across the workforce for individual and particularly collective responsibility through archive-specific facilitated awareness and learning programs that focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. Protocol 2, rights, recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge systems in records by incorporating multiple provenance over time in National Archives collection management systems. Protocol 3, access, enhance descriptive information, search capability and findability by using Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander place names and naming conventions, including additional entries to our Bringing Them Home name index. To enrich the context of records by providing opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to describe and annotate finding aids for records that relate to themselves and communities. To enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's right to reply by facilitating an attachment of a correcting statement to a respective record. To facilitate new approaches for consultation and engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities about National Archives services, programs and collections in a range of different ways. Under the Archives Act 1983 and through National Archives policy, to protect information considered secret or sacred under the customary law of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And through the lens of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, deliver on-site, online and off-site programs that connect and engage people. Protocol 4, authority. Implementing informed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander diverse practice on arrangement and description of collections and the transfer, handling and storage of records with culturally secret, sacred content. Undertake new practices of the Commonwealth Records Series system. The archival control model, ensuring to implement considerations of for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sensitivities, particularly with culturally secret, sacred content and rights. And Protocol 5, acknowledgement. Recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples by displaying acknowledgement of country statements in each of our offices around the country, naming the local Aboriginal language group at all the offices. Follow the Welcome to Country Acknowledgement of Country cultural protocols at all National Archives events, and this is on-site, off-site and online. Also to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's diverse differences and modify as practicable on-site spaces to provide culturally safe areas for individuals or groups to visit and view sensitive or culturally secret, sacred records. Appreciate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's diverse differences and consider that there may be barriers to effective communication and engagement because of past experiences and cultural and traditional differences. Our challenges. There's a lot to cover here. The National Archives acknowledges we have Australia, the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are multicultural, are diverse with different languages, different cultural requirements. Our biggest challenge is engaging with people and being able to do that, mindful that one model is not going to fit all. So we have to look at facilitating new approaches for consultation and engagement with peoples and groups. I say groups first because there are discrete groups rather than communities. And also another challenge is with engagement is focusing on the right to an interest in culturally sacred content in records and having that dialogue with people in a meaningful way, meaningful and open way. And I might ask David to add a little bit more about our other challenges as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Phyllis. I think, it's quite inspiring, Taylor, as well, listening to your perspective from New Zealand and from your institution. I think one of the challenges is going to be sustaining the effort, to make sure that we really do absolutely adopt these protocols as our organisational culture, as part of our culture as archivists, as our culture as public servants, and to sustain that effort over the forthcoming years. That this isn't a one-off, it's not a fad, it's not a sort of an innovation that comes and goes. I think that's going to be one of them. The other is, as Phyllis just mentioned, this is a multicultural issue. We're not dealing with just one First Nation in Australia with one sort of well-defined set of cultural norms. As a national institution spread across Australia, we really have to make sure that we're staying in tune with all of those cultural values and all of those expectations and the needs of all of the different First Nations of Australia. And the description, the way that we are describing that collection, the way we're making that collection available, has got local, respect for local community, as well as somehow feeding into our national obligations. And here, under a Westminster system, we have a piece of legislation, the Archives Act, which is passed by the Commonwealth Parliament. And so it's legislation that must apply to the Commonwealth of Australia. These are the sort of things that are keeping me awake at the moment, sort of thinking, how are we going to navigate through this? Be a National Archives of Australia, but an archives for the First Nations of Australia as well. It's an incredible challenge. I think we're up for it, absolutely, but I just do not underestimate the task ahead. I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you, David. Before going back to the question period, so we understand that we all recognize that the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration is a great step in the right direction, but it's not an end by itself. We recognize that our organization, national organization or state organization, or at the different jurisdictions are a representation of the old colonial power, and they need to change in their approach to indigenous people and in support of the preservation of their culture. We understand that it will be nothing about them without them. Like we say in Canada, it's nothing about us without us. Indigenous people need to have the lead, they need to have more than an influence. They need to be at the heart of all the solutions that are developed. So I think that we have an agreement on all of that between all our speakers. So we will go to the question and answer period. Nicola will join us for that period. For those of you attendees who will ask questions, please If you intend to ask that question to one of the speakers or Nicola, please identify that person. It will facilitate my life. So, to you, dear attendees, it's time for you to ask your questions. And don't worry, they can cope with all questions, provocative or as provocative as they can be. So since we're awaiting questions, I have a few that are already. So I'll go first with to Simon. The declaration, the clause 4C recognizes that access to records containing traditional indigenous cultural expressions, sacred belief, social and legal knowledge should be done in consultation with the affiliated community. Can you describe how your organization or how you envision that consultation process and how you are engaging your organization in that consultation process?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Normand. There's a couple of, I guess, a couple of aspects to that response, and like many jurisdictions here in Australia, we operate under a legislative framework. So we have the State Records Act of South Australia, which came in 1997. From an access point of view, that act is quite clear on the fact that the agencies who create the records are the ones who are responsible for determining access. So part of our role here as the Archival and Record Authority is to try and, I guess, lead the way with those organisations through a cultural change piece to get them to understand that the records that they create are of value and have significant importance outside of their organisation to Aboriginal people individually, but also to groups and communities across the state. So there's a lot of effort that we're putting in conversation with our state government and local government agencies about the need for them to understand that when they're setting access restrictions or making a determination around when a record can be accessed, that they actually do so in conjunction with the people that the record relates to, and in this instance, obviously, the Aboriginal people. In addition to that, then, there's work that we do where there are records in our collection that we think need should be open or more accessible, and we then have discussions with both the relevant communities, and we put pressure on the agencies as well to actually free up those and make those records accessible. So working in conjunction with Aboriginal people or Aboriginal communities to make sure that they get access to the records that they need to through discussions with the agencies and with the communities. So we sort of play a bit of I guess a brokerage role at the moment. Looking forward, I'd like to think that the work we do with the Aboriginal Reference Group and with our sister agency, the State Library, that we are able to build some momentum around people understanding the value of the records outside of the sort of the government system that the records are created in.
Thank you. And Taylor, I'll ask the same question to you just to have a comparative base between New Zealand and one of the Australian states, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so part and parcel of that, how do we describe our consultation process and engage with organisations? Part and parcel is that we have the Protected Records Act 2005, which I'm a bit conscious about my dates because I think I said archive started in 1937 when I've added 20 years, and actually it was 1957. But make that right now. So yeah, with the Public Records Act 2005, within that, it discusses the same things around access and regulation. Part and parcel is that when consulting, or not so much consulting, but collaborating, when acknowledging our 3 Ps within Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the 3 principles, participation, partnership, and protection, is essentially the legislation discusses that it needs to be with settled iwi. which means that the iwi have mobilised, have arranged themselves and gone through the process of te arawhiti to have their grievances and the breakdown of that treaty addressed by the Crown. And as a part of that, that then becomes a settlement process, it becomes legislated, and then again is repositioned into a relationship agreement with the archives, among other agencies and institutions across Aotearoa. That whakaitanga, the agreement, is then what generates those work plans. Now, that's a really thorough stream of how we can have that relationship and the consultation, the collaboration with Māori in these institutions, but it only privileges those that have settled. For those that are still on their journey, for whatever reason, it's almost as if we become inaccessible again. Yet we are the foundation holding these government records that provides essentially the evidence around how we can redress those breaks in Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and hold the Crown accountable. Hold the Crown accountable to not honouring that treaty at the time, where that then is related to Tandanya Declaration is that those 3 Ps that we live with, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, are very much in the same principles, the same 5 principles that exist within Tandanya. And so we see this as complementary, and another way to describe to our colonisers how to go forward and work with us rather than for us.
Thank you, Tela. Very interesting. So a question from Early Bird to Phyllis. Where can we find a copy of the protocols?
Thanks, Norman. The protocols aren't publicly available because they've been newly endorsed in April by our executive board and also approved. We're currently socialising our protocols through the National Archives. The next step for that will be socialising the protocols with our stakeholder groups, consultative forums, Aboriginal Advisory Group, Council of Australasian Archives and Records Authorities, and then it will be made available publicly.
Thank you, Phyllis.
I don't anticipate. Sorry, Norman.
No, continue.
We don't anticipate releasing that widely until 2022.
Okay, thank you. So questions are getting in. A question from Sue McKinnish for David. David, what strategies and targets are in place to employ Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and to provide career pathways from them in your institution?
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Sue. And hello, Sue. Good to hear from you. Nice to see you online. So it's a part of our Atsi strategy that I was talking about earlier, that we do want to increase the representation of Indigenous Australians in our workforce. I tell you, it's a target across the Australian Public Service actually to do this, and it's not something that we have been able to achieve with great success across the public service, and it's something again we need to keep working on. But certainly to mentor and develop Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander staff within the organisation is also a feature of that strategy that was we adopted back in 2017 and is carried forward through into our protocols as well. And the other part of your question there, Sue, about having elders in residence, I think is an interesting concept. To be honest, I hadn't really considered that concept before to be something I'd like to pursue, or at least think about. We do, as Phyllis has said, we have Aboriginal advisory groups, and so we have deliberately established representatives from various communities across Australia to provide advice and build our cultural competency. Here in where I am in Canberra as well, we have the gentleman Paul Howes, a Ngambri custodian who's been working with us over some time to develop our cultural competency. And here in Australia as well, we've adopted the IATSIS core set of modules, which are a fantastic resource to make sure that all our staff are doing all we can to develop that cultural competency. So again, it's a journey. None of these things is an end in itself, but the idea of elders in residence, I find is quite an interesting one. We should talk about that.
Thank you, David. A question from Elena Gardner to both Phyllis and Taylor. David and Simon have spoken about the importance of consulting with Indigenous communities. How important it is, in your mind, to have Indigenous people employed in the archives? Taylor first.
Let me practice unmuting myself again. Kapai. Well, thank you, Elenia, for your question. I think, again, how important is it to have Indigenous people employed in archives? Extremely. 100%. There's no way that you should be operating in archives without having the diversity of the country you're looking after, as well as Indigenous in those spaces. At the end of the day, we hold knowledge and information that no one else is privileged to. It's something that we develop along our entire life and is passed down to us from our elders, passed down from our tupuna. So we come with all that background. Where we need the support from our archives is to create the spaces for us. For some of us in Aotearoa in New Zealand, moving away from home isn't an option. We need to stay in our locations that we were raised, that our ancestors and families come from. So making that leap would be for institutions to actually reach out to those communities, to be in those spaces and provide the access to the records, as well as the employment package, to be based at home rather than moving to these city centres, and again severing those ties to your home base, your whenua. I think for me, a big part of it is that for Aotearoa, we're sitting at 5 million people in 2020 and 16.5% are Māori, yet we're not seeing that in these institutions. We're not seeing that the growth that is occurring for Māori, as well as where we sit as differences between our own iwi. We have our different sub-tribes that have nuanced ways of operating. We don't have that pan-tribal Māoritanga that so many institutions like to put us into. And so how do we address that in these spaces is by having those various groups, those various sub-tribes, those iwi be represented in these spaces. And so far, it is stepping stones, and it is about going bit by bit as a part of this compromise to have Indigenous in these spaces. But really, we have to ask ourselves, create the space, make the money appear, so that we can be in the whare, so that we can be in these archives.
Thank you, Taylor. It's very important. Phyllis, to you.
How important? Extremely important. I want to emphasise the National Archives of Australia holds the stories, images, voices and fingerprints of my family, of my mother, my great aunt, the voices of my father and and his extended family. So they're in the collections of the National Archives. It's important for us to be with these collections, and for the people who care for the collections to have an understanding and an appreciation how connected we are. We're not only connected on a physical level, we're also connected on a non-physical level as well. I might pass away, but my connection to family continues. Similarly, with those collections in archives as well. So it's important for archives and non-Indigenous people who are caring for the collections to have that understanding and appreciation of all the different levels of understanding of interaction with the collections, of handling the collections, and also of interacting with people on a day-to-day basis as well. We are not all the same. We have different requirements.
Thank you, Phyllis. A question from Kirsten Wright to Nicola. What role do professional organizations like the ASA have to play in implementing the Tandanya Declaration versus archival organizations who hold the records?
Thanks. I think we have quite a critical role to play in supporting the implementation of the Declaration. I think, for example, this webinar is a key role that we've played in the organisation with support of the other organisations as well. I think undertaking advocacy and awareness raising will be a critical role for us, and also to support increasing education around the topics that are covered within the Declaration. I think that is across all areas of education. When I say that, we obviously accredit university courses, and through that we can ensure that these topics are included as a core part of the education. We obviously support professional development of already qualified archivists through these webinars, through online courses, and I think that that's a key area where we can support the profession in implementing this and moving forward. So I think we know that as a professional body, we also have to take action. It's not just on the archival organisations who hold the records. It's definitely got overlaps. I think collaboration is really critical. Obviously, we've heard quite a lot of comments coming through around Indigenous representation through employment within archives, and we all know that that's lacking. And I think that that's something the professional bodies have to support as well. We can't just expect the archival organisations to do that themselves. So I think things like career pathways and support in that area are really critical, along with David mentioned sustainability and ensuring that this is something that people continue to pay attention to. And I think that that's a key role which we can support. Obviously, we're across many more organisations, and we have a communications network that we can use to ensure that this is continually communicated and remains a priority for people. So I think they're just some of the key ways that we as the professional body need to act. I think we also have similar issues in terms of the whiteness within our profession. Our council has always been very non-representative in that way, and I think moving towards something like an advisory body would be critical. And so I think in that way we can definitely learn from each other, learn from the actions we're all taking, and work together, because we don't want a lot of work being put onto the same people. And obviously we're a member-based organisation which expects a lot of volunteer work in comparison to the archival organisations which might be paying people in their roles. And I think that that's something we have to consider seriously to ensure that we're not putting emotional labour onto the few Indigenous archivists that are able to support this work, and that we are paying them properly for their support to do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicola. A question for Simon from Emma Savage. What work is being done to facilitate and welcome first people into the industry as qualified participants, not just as owner or audience for the records?
Thank you, Normand. That's a really interesting question, Emma, and it's one that I was actually having a discussion with some colleagues about recently, where we were talking about the fact that there are a whole range of programs and graduate support programs to bring Aboriginal people who are at university into working in either the information management, archival, or information technology sector. But where I think a lot of this falls down is that that's focused on university and it's not focused on schools. And I think there needs to be a big focus on the high school sector to encourage Aboriginal students to consider working in the archival sector. And I think the major archival institutions have a significant role to play there, working both with the education sector, but also with the Aboriginal communities and there's an Aboriginal college here in Adelaide, Townley College, and there's an opportunity for us to look at working and partnering with them to encourage Aboriginal people to move into the archival sector. So I think we are underrepresented by quite a significant amount in terms of the number of Aboriginal archivists, and it's something that I would like the sector generally to pay some significant attention to. And I think it's really important for us, particularly having listened to Taylor and Phyllis and what they've said about having Aboriginal archivists working on staff. And I'm fortunate that I've got some excellent Aboriginal staff working here at State Records, but we need more coming through, and we need to be encouraging and making it an environment where they actually want to come and join us.
Thank you, Simon. For David, Joanne Schneider asked, it's a multi-layered question, but there's one thing I want you to approach, David, is the question of repatriation, digital or physical, to groups or nations or communities.
Yeah, look, I think this also can be a very complex issue to deal with, but it's, it goes back to Phyllis, your comments earlier about that personal story you were telling about your connection, your familial connection with the records, and I think Taylor, you were also talking about place, the importance of location and place in terms of how we work. I think I think when we address this, we do have to take on board the significance of a record. And if that significance is the information that it conveys, that it's a document which provides some insight to someone's rights, entitlements, or history, or whether the document has got a special value in its tangible form. And so I think, the idea of repatriation does have to make sure that what we are doing is connecting people with the evidence of their past. And so whatever it takes to properly, faithfully connect people with the evidence of the past is what we have to do. And if that means physically locating a record somewhere, then we should strive to do that. And that should be the repatriation. And the digitization should then serve to pluralize, to make that information properly and respectfully available to other Australians that have got a legitimate purpose and right to use it. So I do think, repatriation is it's an international issue. Of course, we're all talking about it across the community. But that for me is, our job here is we're trying to connect people with the evidence of the past, and we just need to unpack that, and whatever it takes, that's what we should strive to do.
Thank you, David. Some of the other questions coming from Joanne, I think I'll ask Phyllis to answer. Can you expand on community-focused guides and measures for group access to their collective records?
Okay, thanks, Normand. Thanks, Joanne. A question about access to collections and guides. I'll try and pick up on that. The National Archives has fact sheets and also guides, particularly focus on the collections held in the Northern Territory and also collections held in Victoria. I'm sorry, Norman, I didn't quite get
Okay,
the
so
question.
so you're are you developing guides for specific communities for the members of those communities to have access to the records that concerns them?
Okay. Where we might receive a request from a specific community for collections of records relating to the communities, we will provide details of what collections which may be held in the National Archives. And so those details are provided to individuals and to communities as well. The National Archives also has the Bringing Them Home name index, and so this is another way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people particularly can find information for family history and community link up.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you. I'll go to Talia. Talia, I have a personal question to you. I'm working in the library and archives. I often go to the International Federation of Library Association conference, and I always met with Maori librarians from New Zealand. There's I don't know how many librarians are Maori librarians in New Zealand, but there's my understanding a lot more librarians than archivists, and Maori librarian or archivists in New Zealand. So what are you doing at the National Archives, at the Archives of New Zealand, to work with academia to develop a contingent of Maori archivists who can work in the different archives in the country? Are you working with academia to develop programs and to special programs like they have on the librarianship side?
Sure, cool. Thanks, Norman. Where my understanding, because it's also early days for me with Archives New Zealand compared to some of my colleagues who have been here for many years, we are participating in those areas of academia. We are engaging on various relationships across Archives New Zealand, being that we have 4 sites across the entire country. So different regional archivists or different directors within the Wellington office of Archives New Zealand will have a relationship to academia and how to tap into one of those locations that archivists are coming from. I think part of looking towards Māori archivists is that there's a different pathway again that we don't necessarily acknowledge as a approved avenue of that kind of knowledge for Māori, and for the skill set that you develop and those life experiences that I previously mentioned that you gain as being Māori, growing up Māori in Aotearoa, because there is no other location where we're Indigenous to, is that essentially our orators, our weavers, our carvers, our different specialists, tāmoko artists, the tattooists, will all have these little skills in there that create an amazing archivist. How are we able to tap into those sources to bring in that knowledge source to be able to then get a layer of archival theory to be on top of that? There is definitely the professional archivist, but when you're wanting to get that holistic Indigenous worldview, you can't just create an archivist. They're woven with all these other experiences. And so we need to be looking beyond those fields. And really, it comes down to a sense of relationships. How do we, inside of Archives New Zealand, have and maintain our relationships outside so that we can advocate that this is a safe space for Māori to be working in, that we can look after both your spiritual, cultural, mental, physical well-being while coming to work for a colonial institution. All these things need to be taken into account for that next generation, because we're not necessarily going to create another army of Māori archivists to just come in and do same old, same old. It's been nearly 180 years since we signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi, so it's getting a bit tiring. It's tiring doing the same old, same old. We want to see something different. So how do we do that? By setting our own scene.
Yeah. Thank you, Talia. They're very interesting. So we still have a few minutes. So I'll ask the speakers and Nicola to ask questions. We don't have any more time? No? Sorry about that. I can continue. It's only 11:23 p.m. here. So I'm ready to rumble. So I think that I'm asked to end the show for tonight. So, but before ending the webinar, I will encourage all the attendees to have a look to the Tandanya-Adelaide Declaration and to endorse, or to make sure that their organization, their professional association, their community endorse the declaration, because it's an important step in the right direction. It's not the final step. We're far from being where we need to be, but it's a good way to start the process, and we're on the right path if we endorse and apply the declaration as it is. So I don't know, Nicola, if you can add where our Australian colleague, or Talia, our our colleague from New Zealand can endorse, how they can endorse the Tandanya Declaration.
Yeah, so as the ASA, we are asking any Australian organisations that want to share the fact that they've endorsed the declaration. We will create a specific page on our website that's really clear, so that we bring everyone together with their statements about why they're endorsing it and some of the actions they're taking. So we want to provide a home for that, so that it's really obvious, really findable and discoverable, and really transparent of organisations who are taking steps to endorse the Tandanya Declaration. So we have a statement out, and it's been shared today, that includes, but just email the ASA and we will include you onto the website straight away.
So, and Kayla, for New Zealand, do you have a similar information to share? I think that,
I'm back.
Okay, you're back. So is there a way for colleagues from New Zealand to go somewhere to endorse the Tandanya Declaration? Is there a place that you know of?
So Archives New Zealand has endorsed the Tandanya Declaration, and that's something that we're in progress to get onto our online channels and our web pages at the moment, and then hopefully we can keep developing that further and provide that place.
Okay, thank you, Taylor. So I as a closing word for today's webinar, the next step for us is to also push for the Tandanya Declaration to be more public for those indigenous communities in some countries who are still not welcome, appreciated, and sometimes discouraged of maintaining their indigenous identity. We need to push, and I have a list in my mind that I won't share because it won't be very diplomatic, but I'm sure that you have your own list. So we need to make sure that those indigenous communities in other countries who are less lucky than us, than in ours, it's not that it's perfect in our countries. It's far from being perfect, but compared to others, it's better. So we have to push for all indigenous communities in the world to know about the Tandanya Declaration, and for the government to be pushed to endorse it, to respect and to support the preservation of and development of indigenous cultures. So, so thank you all. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you to the organizers. It was a great way to finish the day for me. And it's a great way, I'm sure, for you to spend the middle of your day. And it was very interesting, and it was nice to discover all your comments. And I'm sure that in the comments in the chat, there's a lot of appreciation for the discussion tonight. And thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.